The bread was still warm when she broke it. Mira liked that part best. The give of the crust under her thumbs, the small cloud of steam that rose up smelling of yeast and rosemary, and the particular char of the kitchen's north oven, which always ran hot on the left side. She tore off a piece no bigger than a coin. She pressed it to her tongue. She waited, the way she waited every morning, counting her own heartbeat instead of the seconds, because counting seconds made the fear worse. 1 beat, 2, no bitterness, no metal-bright sting behind the molars that the old taster, Yvette, used to describe in her ledger before her hand stopped writing entirely. No swelling of the tongue, no flowers and rot smell rising up off her own breath that would mean nightshade, or the particular cold numb spread along the gums that meant something rarer, something the kitchen herbalist only ever called the patient one, because it waited days to kill you and smiled the whole time. Nothing, just bread. She swallowed, marked the loaf with a chalk tally on the underside of the basket. Safe, hour, date, and reached for the honey. That was the part that curdled, because the jar was already open, because someone had left a spoon resting inside it, handle up, the way no one in this kitchen ever left a spoon, not since the steward had drilled into every scullery hand that nothing touched the king's food without gloved hands and a witness. Because when she lifted the spoon to her face out of pure habit, smell first. Always smell first. Her whole body had learned that before her mind ever caught up. The honey didn't smell like honey. It smelled like honey, and underneath it, so faint she almost let it go, it smelled like almonds that had never grown on a tree. She was the king's poison taster. She had held this title for 141 days, which made her, as far as anyone in this kitchen could remember, the longest surviving taster in the history of the Ashvale pack, a fact that the head cook liked to say with a kind of grim pride, as though Mira were a particularly hardy strain of crop that had simply refused, against all odds, to die in the field. The job killed most who held it within a season. It had killed 4 women before her. It would, statistically, almost certainly kill her too. She had taken the job anyway, because her mother's debts didn't care whether she lived to pay them, and because starving slowly in a border village had never struck her as a better death than the one she might get here. Fast, in a king's kitchen, at least with her belly full first. She had not expected, on day 142, to be the one thing standing between the Alpha King of Ashvale and the people who wanted him in the ground. She did not know that yet. She only knew that the honey was wrong, that her hands had gone very still and very cold, and that somewhere 2 corridors away, the king was already seated at his table, waiting for his breakfast, completely unaware that someone in his own household had just tried, again, to kill him through something as small and as sweet as a spoonful of honey. The kitchens of Ashvale Keep ran on rules older than most of the staff who followed them, rules that had calcified into ritual the way old fear always does. Every dish that reached the king's table passed through 3 hands: the cook who made it, the steward who inspected it, and the taster who ate it. No taster touched food alone. No taster left the kitchen without a witness signing the log, and no taster, under any circumstance, was permitted to refuse a dish, because a taster who refused was a taster under suspicion, and a taster under suspicion in Ashvale did not stay employed for long. She did not stay anything for long. Mira had learned the rules in her first week from Greta, the head cook, a broad-shouldered woman with flour permanently worked into the creases of her knuckles, and a habit of testing the heat of any pan by holding her palm 2 inches above it, and counting under her breath in a dialect Mira didn't recognize. Greta had also told her, on that first day, not to get attached to anything in this kitchen, including her own fingers. "You'll want to be careful with the honey jars," Greta had said. not looking up from the dough she was folding. Always smell before you taste. Whatever's wrong with food, it's wrong in the nose first. Eyes lie. Nose doesn't. Mira had thought, at the time, that this was simply good kitchen sense. She understood now. 141 days, 3 near misses, and 1 very dead predecessor later. That in a world of wolves, where every soul in this castle could shift skin and bone into something with fangs and a nose 10 times sharper than a human's, scent was not just sense. It was truth. A wolf could smell a lie forming in someone's throat before the words left their mouth. A wolf could smell fear sweating out through someone's collar. Smell rage building like a storm front. Smell desire bloom warm and unmistakable in a room before anyone so much as looked at anyone else. Mira was not a wolf. She was something rarer in this castle and infinitely more disposable. Human. Born without claws or fangs, or the bond magic that ran golden and ancient through every wolf bloodline. Hired specifically because a human body reacted to most poisons faster and more visibly than a wolf's did. Wolves healed too quickly. Wolves metabolized too efficiently. A poison that would kill a human in an hour might only give a wolf a headache and a craving for raw meat. So they hired humans. They hired women mostly because the dead ones drew less attention than dead men did. And because, though no one ever said this part aloud, a woman's death in service was simply easier for everyone else to live with. She had read every page of Yvette's old ledger in her first week, back when the steward still let her into the records room, back before someone decided that wasn't necessary anymore. Yvette had served the king for 11 days. Her handwriting in the ledger started clean and careful. Safe, safe, safe. A faint metallic edge today, noted to herbalist, and ended on a single line that had clearly been written by a hand already shaking. Tastes of almonds tonight. Going to find out who. She never found out who. She died 4 hours after writing that line, in the small stone room off the kitchen reserved for tasters who fell ill, with no one beside her but a scullery girl too frightened to do more than hold the basin. Mira thought about that line more often than she let herself admit. Tastes of almonds tonight. The honey in her hand, 142 days into her own service, smelled exactly like that. She did not run to the king's table. Running drew attention, and attention, in this place, got people killed faster than poison did. She walked, fast, controlled, the basket of bread balanced against her hip like nothing at all was wrong, straight past Greta, who caught one look at her face and straightened from the dough without being asked. Mira. Don't touch the honey, Mira said, low, not stopping. Don't let anyone touch it. I need the steward. Greta's face didn't change much. She had survived 4 tasters' deaths in this kitchen and learned not to let her face change much for anything. But her hand came down flat and final on the honey jar, claiming it, guarding it, before Mira had even finished speaking. The corridor between the kitchens and the king's private dining hall was long and narrow and lined with the kind of old stone that held cold even in summer, and Mira had walked it so many times now that her feet knew every uneven flagstone without her eyes needing to check. She knew, too, exactly where the air changed. The moment the corridor opened toward the hall, where the smell of stone and tallow gave way to wood smoke and leather, and underneath all of it, something darker and warmer that she had never been able to name properly until the day Greta told her, flat and matter of fact, that it was simply the smell of him. Alpha blood ran heavy with scent markers ordinary wolves didn't carry. The king's scent didn't fill a room so much as claim it. Mira had told herself, the first dozen times she noticed it, that she was only noticing it the way anyone would notice smoke or rain. A fact about the air. Nothing more. She was getting worse at believing that lie by the week. The king was already seated when she came through the doorway, one elbow on the table, a letter half read and abandoned beside his plate. His dark head bent toward the window as though something out past the glass interested him more than anything happening inside this room ever could. Cale Ashvale, Alpha King of the Ashvale Pack, 28th of his line, 6 years on the throne after his father's death, and, depending on who in the castle you asked, either the most dangerous man in the kingdom or the most exhausted one. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, and something in his face did the thing it always did when she entered a room. Not quite a softening, nothing so generous as that, but a settling, the way a held breath settles once it's released. He looked for 1/2 second, like a man who had been waiting for exactly her and no one else. Then he saw her face properly, and the settling vanished. "What?" he said. Not a question, a demand, low and immediate, the voice of a man who had learned a long time ago that hesitation cost lives. "The honey," Mira said. "Don't let anyone serve it. It's wrong." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence, and the chair he'd been sitting in scraped back hard enough to leave a mark on the stone floor that would still be there a year from now. He smelled it before he tasted anything, the way he always did, the way every wolf in this castle did without thinking about it, head bent low over the jar Greta had carried in herself, nostrils flaring once, twice, his whole body going very still in the particular way that Mira had learned over 141 days meant he was reading the air the way she read a recipe, looking for what didn't belong. "Almonds," he said finally, straightening. His jaw had gone tight, a muscle working there that hadn't been working a minute ago. Where it shouldn't be. "That's what killed Yvette," Mira said. "The almond smell. It's in her ledger. Last thing she wrote before." "I know what's in the ledger." Sharper than he meant it, she thought, because his hand came up 1/2 inch, as if to soften the words, and then dropped again, as if he'd remembered, mid-gesture, that softening wasn't something he allowed himself in front of witnesses. There were 3 guards at the door, the steward in the corner with his ledger and his carefully blank face, and Cale Ashvale did not soften in front of an audience. Mira had learned that about him in her 2nd week, and had never once seen the rule broken. What she had seen, twice now, was the way his eyes found hers first in any crowded room, and held there a 1/2 second longer than they needed to. "You didn't taste it," he said. Not quite a question either. "I smelled it first, like Greta taught me." Mira kept her voice even, the way she'd trained herself to, because a shaking voice in this castle got read as guilt as often as it got read as fear. "I wasn't going to put almond poison honey on my tongue to prove a point, Your Grace." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, too tired and too brief to earn that name, but close enough that Mira felt it land somewhere under her ribs anyway. "No," he said. "I wouldn't want you to." It was such a small thing to say. It should not have warmed her the way it did. The steward's name was Aldrich, and he had served 3 generations of Ashvale kings with a devotion so total that the castle staff spoke of him the way people spoke of weather, a fixed feature of the world, unchangeable, present in every room before you noticed he'd entered it. He was a tall man, narrow through the shoulders, with a habit Mira had clocked in her 1st week and never seen broken. He tapped the 3rd finger of his right hand against whatever surface was nearest, whenever he was thinking hardest. 3 taps, always 3, like a man counting something only he could see. He was tapping now, standing over the honey jar with his ledger open and his pen still. 3 taps against the table's edge while Cale questioned the kitchen staff one by one. Who had access? Who had been in the larder that morning? Who had touched the jar since it was last sealed? No one had an answer that satisfied him. No one ever did. This is the fourth attempt this season, Aldrich said quietly, once the staff had been dismissed, and it was only the three of them left in the cooling dining hall, Cale, Aldrich, and Mira, standing slightly apart with her empty basket still on her hip, because no one had told her to leave and she hadn't trusted herself to ask. Fourth, that we know of. There may have been others your taster caught and never reported, simply by doing her job well enough that nothing reached this table to be noticed as an attempt at all. Cale's gaze cut to Mira at that, considering, and she felt it the way she always felt his attention, a warmth along her skin that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "How many?" he said. "Have you caught that you didn't think worth mentioning?" Mira hesitated. Honesty, in this castle, was a currency she'd learned to spend carefully. 3. Before today. A tainted stew in my second week. I thought it was just spoiled meat at first. Wine that smelled wrong in month 2. And bread, once, that had something ground into the flour I couldn't name, so I just didn't serve it. Told Greta to bake a new batch and said nothing more. 3. Cale repeated, very quiet. You didn't ask, Mira said. And I didn't think a king wanted a daily accounting of every small thing that might have killed him. You'd never eat anything at all. Aldrich's pen had gone still over the ledger. 3 taps, and then nothing. His eyes flicking between the king and the taster with an expression Mira couldn't quite read. Not quite alarm, not quite approval. Something more careful than either. Cale didn't laugh. Mira had only ever heard him laugh once, low and surprised, over something one of his hounds had done in the yard, and the sound had stayed with her for days afterward like a smell she couldn't wash off. But something in his face eased, just slightly, just enough that the tight line of his jaw softened by a fraction. You should have told me, he said. You should eat more carefully, Mira said back, and watched his eyebrow climb half an inch, watched Aldrich's mouth twitch at the corner before he smoothed it back into stillness, and felt, for one dangerous second, like she had won something. She thought, walking back to the kitchens an hour later with the basket empty and her hands still faintly cold, that this was probably the part where most people would have started being afraid for their own life, rather than his. She'd held the job long enough to know that fear, eventually, did set in for that reason. It had simply taken longer to arrive than she expected, and arrived sideways, less about her own death and more about a different and far more inconvenient possibility, that if someone succeeded in killing Cale Ashvale, the loss she'd feel wouldn't be the loss of an employer. It would be the loss of a man whose voice she'd started listening for before she even reached the dining hall door, whose attention, when it landed on her, she'd started craving the way she used to crave bread when her family went hungry for 3 days running back home, a need under her ribs that had nothing rational about it and didn't care that it was inconvenient. That was the part no one warned her about when they hired her. Not the poison. The poison she'd expected, priced into the job the way drowning is priced into the work of a sailor. No one warned her that the danger that would actually wreck her wasn't going to come from a jar of tainted honey. It was going to come from a king who looked at her like she mattered, in a castle where she was supposed to be furniture that occasionally died. 3 days passed without incident, which in Ashvale Keep counted as a small miracle. Mira tasted bread, tasted broth, tasted a venison stew that Greta had spent the better part of an afternoon coaxing into something rich and dark with juniper and red wine, and found nothing wrong in any of it beyond the honest, mouth-watering ache of food she wished, for one selfish second, she were allowed to actually eat her fill of rather than a single ceremonial bite. She tasted the king's wine each evening, a small ritual that had become, without either of them naming it as such, the quietest and steadiest part of her day. He would watch her over the rim of his own untouched cup while she drank from his, A half-second exchange where for just a moment the wine in her mouth and the wine that would later touch his lips were the same wine, the same vintage. A strange intimacy neither of them had ever spoken aloud. On the third evening, he asked her a question that wasn't about poison at all. "Where are you from?" His voice was low, almost careless, the way a man asks a question he's been holding on to for longer than he wants to admit. The dining hall had emptied of everyone but the two of them, and a single guard stationed well out of earshot near the door, and the candlelight had gone soft and gold the way it always did this late, catching on the rim of his cup, on the dark fall of his hair where it had come loose from its tie during the day. "A border village," Mira said. "South of here. You wouldn't know it. It doesn't have a name worth knowing, just a river and too many debts." "Your family's debts." "My mother's. She borrowed against a harvest that failed twice running. I took this job because the pay was good and because—" She stopped herself, the next words rising too easily, too honestly in the candlelight's strange permission. "Because I didn't think anyone would miss me much if it went wrong." Something shifted across his face, fast and unguarded before he caught it. "Someone would have missed you." "You didn't know my name 3 months ago." "I know it now." The words sat between them, simple as that, and Mira felt her pulse pick up in a way that had nothing to do with fear of poison. The wine in her glass had gone warm from her hand. Somewhere outside, an owl called once, low, and the candle between them guttered and steadied again. "Mira," he said, like he was testing the shape of it. "It suits you better than I expected a taster's name to." "What did you expect? Something grimmer?" "I expected not to learn it at all." His eyes held hers, dark and unreadable and entirely too steady. Tasters don't usually last long enough for names to matter. It should have frightened her, the bluntness of that. Instead, it landed somewhere warm and aching, because she understood, in the half-second before he looked away, that he had been bracing himself against exactly this, against learning her name, against caring whether it mattered, against the particular grief of losing someone he'd let himself know. She didn't say any of that aloud. She only finished her wine, set the glass down with more care than it required, and let the silence between them stretch until the guard at the door shifted his weight and reminded them both, without meaning to, that they were never quite as alone as the candlelight pretended. The wound happened on an ordinary Tuesday, which felt, afterward, like the cruelest part of it. That something so significant had started in a moment with no warning, no charge in the air beforehand, nothing to mark it as the day everything changed. A border skirmish. A rival pack's scouting party had crossed too far into Ashvale land, and Cale had ridden out himself rather than send his guard alone, because, as Mira would learn later, pieced together from things Aldrich let slip and things Greta refused to elaborate on, a king who never bled himself for his own borders was a king who lost his pack's respect faster than any poison could kill him. He came back at dusk with a gash along his ribs that hadn't closed the way wolf wounds usually closed, fast and clean, knitting themselves back together within hours. This one was sluggish. Wrong. The healer took one look, one smell, and went very pale. "Silver," she said. "There's silver in the wound. Just a fragment, but it's enough to slow the healing. Maybe stop it outright if we don't get it out clean." Cale, stripped to the waist on the narrow bed in his own chamber, jaw clenched hard enough that Mira could see the muscle jump along it from where she stood by the door, said only, "Then get it out." The healer's hands were shaking too badly to manage it. Her own daughter had been one of the scouting party's casualties 3 years back, in an earlier skirmish with the same rival pack, and something about silver in a wound undid her composure every time she had to face it. Aldrich was needed elsewhere, coordinating the guard. Every steady hand in the castle, it seemed, was occupied with something else. "I'll do it," Mira said. 3 heads turned toward her at once, Kale's, the healer's, and the young guard hovering uselessly near the window. "You're not trained for this," the healer said, not unkindly, just factually. "I've pulled splinters and fishhooks out of half my village growing up," Mira said. "I have steady hands and I'm not afraid of blood. Tell me where to cut and I'll cut." Kale's eyes found hers across the room, dark and pained, and, underneath the pain, something that looked almost like relief. "Do it," he said. This was, Mira understood later, the moment the rest of the story turned on. Though it took her time to see it that way, because in the moment itself it felt like nothing more than necessity. Forceps. A small, sharp blade. The healer talking her through the angle with a voice gone thin and careful. Kale's hand fisted in the bedsheet beside him, knuckles white, his breath coming in low, controlled pulls through his nose because a wolf's pride didn't allow him to make a sound louder than that. Not even now. She worked the silver fragment free with hands that were, in fact, steadier than she felt, guided more by instinct and the healer's murmured directions than any real skill. And the whole time she worked, she was close enough to him that his scent filled every breath she took. That dark, warm, wood smoke thing under the copper tang of blood, but laced now with something else, something rawer. Pain had its own scent, she realized. Pain smelled like fear's quieter cousin, sharp and clean, nothing like the rot sweetness of poison. The fragment came free with a small, ugly sound, and Kale's whole body went slack against the bed at once, the tension leaving him in a single long exhale that Mira felt against her own skin like a physical thing. "There," she said, voice not quite steady now that the worst of it was done. "It's out." He didn't answer right away. When she looked up from the wound, he was watching her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Stripped bare, unguarded, none of the careful distance he kept in front of guards and counselors and steel-faced servants. His eyes were wet at the corners, not from tears exactly, more from the sheer animal cost of holding still through pain he could have screamed through and chose not to. "Mira," he said, and her name in his mouth in that moment sounded like something closer to a prayer than a word. "You should rest," she said, because she didn't trust herself to say anything else. His hand came up, slow, careful, like a man reaching for something he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch, and closed around her wrist where it still hovered near the wound, blood-slicked and trembling now that the work was done. "Stay," he said, "just until the wound closes. I don't—" He stopped, jaw working, and started again, quieter. "I don't sleep well with strangers in the room. You're not a stranger anymore." It was such a small confession, and it cost her something enormous to hear it. She stayed. The wound began to close properly within the hour, the silver's poison finally clear of his blood. But Mira stayed long after it would have been reasonable to leave, sitting in the chair beside his bed while he drifted in and out of an exhausted, healing sleep, the candle burning low, and the castle gone quiet around them in the particular hush that settled over a place once its violence for the day was finished. She watched him sleep and told herself she was only watching for signs of fever, for anything wrong in his breathing, the same vigilance she'd have given any patient. That was a lie, and she knew it was a lie even as she told it to herself. He looked younger asleep, the careful, guarded weight he carried in every waking hour, the weight of a crown that had killed his father, of a pack that watched him for weakness the way wolves watch any leader, of enemies inside his own walls who'd tried 4 times this season alone to end him. All of it fell away when his eyes were closed, and what was left was just a man. dark hair fallen loose across his forehead. One hand still curled loosely near the bandage at his ribs, as if even in sleep he was guarding the wound. "You're staring," he said, without opening his eyes, and Mira's whole face went hot. "I'm watching for fever." "You're staring." A faint, exhausted smile ghosted across his mouth. "I can smell it on you, you know, when you're lying." Her breath caught. What does lying smell like? Like honey gone slightly off. His eyes opened, dark and warm in the candlelight, holding hers with an intensity that should have felt dangerous, and instead felt like coming in from cold weather. "You smell like that right now." "That's not fair," she said. "You can read me and I can't read you at all. I'm not lying." His voice had dropped, low and rough with sleep and something else underneath it. "I haven't lied to you once. Not about the food. Not about anything." It wasn't quite true. She would learn that later, the shape of the lie he was keeping even then, even in this raw, unguarded moment. But in the candlelight, with his hand finding hers again and holding it loosely against the sheet, she believed him completely, and some reckless, hungry part of her stopped caring whether belief was wise. The kitchen the next morning smelled, as it always did before dawn, of yeast and embers, and the particular mineral tang of well water drawn fresh from the courtyard pump, and underneath all of it, faint and new, something that made Mira stop dead in the doorway with the empty basket still on her hip. Roses. Out of season, out of place, the smell of them sweet and cloying and entirely wrong for a kitchen in late autumn. "Greta," she said, "where's that coming from?" Greta didn't look up from the bread she was shaping, but her shoulders had gone tight in a way Mira recognized now, after months in this kitchen, as the particular stillness of someone choosing their words with care. "Lady Sarah sent flowers down for the king's table. Said autumn ought to have something pretty in it." Lady Sarah. Mira had heard the name before. A noble woman from a neighboring pack, beautiful and sharp-tongued and, by every account Mira had gathered from gossiping kitchen girls, deeply invested in becoming the next Alpha Queen of Ashvale. She visited the castle often enough that the staff had stopped remarking on it, though they hadn't stopped watching her, the way staff everywhere watch anyone who circles too close to power without quite earning it honestly. "Roses don't grow this time of year," Mira said. "They do in a glass house, if you've got coin enough to keep one heated through autumn." Greta's hands kept working the dough, steady and unbothered on the surface, but her eyes flicked once toward Mira, sharp and assessing. "You'll be tasting whatever dish those flowers are meant to decorate. Be careful with the petals if there's any in the food itself. Some roses are only roses. Some have been bred wrong, sweetened with something that isn't sugar." It was, Mira understood without needing it spelled out further, a warning about more than flowers. Lady Sarah arrived at the king's table that evening dressed in deep green silk that caught the candlelight like water, her dark hair loose and gleaming, a string of pale stones at her throat that Mira recognized, with a small, unpleasant lurch, as moonstone, a gift stone, traditionally given between mates, or between those hoping to become mates. "Your Grace," Sarah said, sweeping into a bow that managed to be both perfectly correct and somehow performed entirely for an audience. "I hope the roses pleased you. I had them sent specially." "They were. Unexpected," Cale said, in the careful, neutral tone Mira had learned meant he was choosing diplomacy over honesty. "I find unexpected things often please more than the expected ones." Sarah's gaze swept the table, found Mira standing slightly apart with her tasting tray, and lingered there a half-second too long, assessing. "And who is this? I don't believe we've met." "My taster," Kyle said. "Mira." "Ah." Something flickered across Sarah's face, gone too fast for Mira to read clearly. Not quite contempt, not quite curiosity. Something colder and more calculating than either. The one who's lasted longer than the rest. How fortunate for you, Your Grace, to have found someone so durable. The word landed wrong, deliberately wrong, dressed up as a compliment and carrying a blade underneath it, and Mira felt heat climb up her neck even as she kept her face carefully blank. She had learned in 140-some days of service exactly how to make her face blank. Cale's jaw had tightened, the muscle there jumping once. "Mira has saved my life 4 times this season," he said, voice gone flat and dangerous in a way Mira had heard directed at no one but threats. "I'd choose a different word than durable." Sarah's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes did. "Of course, Your Grace. I only meant it as a kindness." It did not feel to Mira like a kindness at all. The dish that evening was a saddle of lamb dressed with the rose petals Sarah had sent, and Mira tasted it the way she tasted everything. Small bite, careful pause, the long count of her own heartbeat, and found nothing wrong beyond a faint bitterness in the petals themselves that the herbalist later confirmed was simply the bitterness of roses grown too fast in a glass house. Nothing sinister, just badly grown flowers. But it was the wine that night that worried her more than the food. Sarah had brought her own bottle. A gift, she'd said, from her family's own vineyards. A rare vintage worth more than most of the castle staff earned in a year. And insisted, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, that the king try it himself first, as a guest's gesture rather than passing it through the usual ritual. "Surely you don't suspect me of poisoning my own gift," Sarah said, when Mira reached for the bottle before Cale's cup could be filled. "That would be rather insulting, taster." "It's not about suspicion," Mira said, keeping her voice level, keeping her hands steady around the bottle's neck. "It's protocol. Everything that reaches his table passes through me first. No exceptions." "Even gifts from his future queen?" The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and Mira felt every person at the table go very quiet at once. The guard near the door, Aldrich in his corner with his ledger, even the candle flames seeming to hold their breath. Cale's voice, when it came, was low and absolutely final. "There is no future queen at this table, Lady Sarah. Mira tastes the wine. That is not a request." Mira tasted the wine. It was, in fact, simply very good wine. Nothing wrong in it at all, and she said so, and watched Sarah's mouth curve into something that was almost, but not quite, a genuine smile. "How disappointing," Sarah said, light as anything, "to have nothing dramatic to report. It was a joke." Mira didn't laugh, and neither, she noticed, did Cale. That should have been the worst of it, that particular evening, a noble woman's barbed manners, a tense dinner. Nothing more sinister than wounded pride on Mira's part at being called durable like livestock. Instead, it was only the opening note of something that built, over the following weeks, into a low, constant hum of dread that Mira couldn't quite name and couldn't quite shake. Sarah came to the castle more often after that. She brought gifts each time, wine, sweets, a fur-lined cloak she insisted on draping over Cale's shoulders herself in front of the whole hall, her hands lingering at his collar a half-second longer than necessary, while her eyes found Mira across the room and held there, sharp and pointed as a blade's edge. Mira tasted everything Sarah brought. Every gift came back clean, and yet the feeling in her gut never eased. That particular unease she'd learned over months in this kitchen, not to dismiss even when the evidence stayed clean, because evidence and intuition didn't always arrive at the same time. Greta had a saying for it, something her own mother had taught her. The nose knows before the tongue does. Sometimes the nose knows before there's anything at all to smell yet. Mira's nose, every time Sarah entered a room, told her something was deeply, dangerously wrong. And her tongue, every single time, found nothing to confirm it. It was Aldrich who finally gave her the thread worth pulling, though he didn't mean to, and didn't seem entirely happy about it once he realized what he'd done. She found him late one night in the records room, the same room she'd been quietly barred from months ago, his lamp burning low and his ledger open before him, 3 fingers tapping against the desk's edge in that endless habit of his, while he stared at a page he didn't seem to be reading. "You're not meant to be in here," he said, without looking up, though there was no real heat in it. "Neither are you, this late." Mira had come looking for chamomile from the herb stores for the king's evening tea, a small kindness she'd taken to offering on nights when his shoulders carried the particular tightness that meant council meetings had gone badly, and had not expected to find the steward sitting alone with his ledger and an expression she could only describe as haunted. "What's wrong?" Aldrich was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its usual careful neutrality. "Yvette," he said, "the taster before you. I knew her better than the records show." Mira's breath went still. "How well?" "Well enough that I should have caught what was happening to her sooner than I did." He closed the ledger, finally, and looked up, and his eyes in the lamplight were older than she'd ever seen them. "She came to me, 3 days before she died, certain someone close to the king wanted him gone. She had a name. She never got to write it down, or if she did, the page is missing. I've looked. Believe me, I've looked." "Who?" Mira said. "Did she suspect?" Aldrich's jaw tightened, 3 taps of his finger against the closed ledger, and for one long moment Mira thought he wouldn't answer at all. "I don't know," he said finally. "That's the truth of it. She never told me a name, only that it was someone with access, someone the king trusted enough not to question." It was not, Mira understood with a slow cold settling in her chest, a very large circle of people that description could apply to. She didn't sleep well that night, turning the steward's words over and over until they wore grooves in her like water through stone. Someone with access. Someone the king trusted enough not to question. Aldrich had access. So did Greta. So, in a different way, did the guards who'd served the king since boyhood, men who'd grown up alongside him and would have died for him without a second thought. Or so everyone assumed. And assumption Mira was learning fast in this castle was exactly the soil poison grew best in. She found Cale in his study near midnight, a single candle burning low over a scatter of correspondence he clearly wasn't reading. His head bowed, and one hand pressed against his closed eyes, in a posture of exhaustion so complete it made something in Mira's chest ache to see it. "You should be asleep," she said from the doorway. "So should you." He didn't look up, but his voice had warmed slightly, the way it always did now when he registered it was her and not someone else. "What kept you?" "Aldrich," Mira said, and watched his head come up at that, attention sharpening. "He told me something about Yvette tonight, about what she suspected before she died. She told him everything. The steward's haunted face, the missing page, the suspicion of someone close enough to never be questioned, and watched the words land on him like physical blows, his shoulders drawing tighter with each detail, his jaw working in that way that meant he was holding something back from his own face. "I have enemies inside this castle," he said finally, voice flat and tired, in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. "I've known that for years. What I haven't known is who, exactly, and I've grown sick of guessing wrong." "Who have you guessed?" His eyes found hers, dark and weighted with something she couldn't name yet. "More people than I'd like to admit, including, for one terrible week last spring, you." Mira's breath caught, Me. You arrived the same month 3 previous tasters had already died under suspicious circumstances. New, unconnected to anyone I knew, willing to take a job no one sane would want. His voice had gone rough, almost ashamed. I had you watched for 2 weeks before I let myself believe you were exactly what you appeared to be. A woman who needed the coin and had nothing to do with any of it. It should have stung hearing that he'd suspected her, watched her, weighed her life against his own paranoia before deciding she was safe to trust. Instead, strangely, it landed as something closer to relief. He hadn't trusted blindly. He'd trusted carefully, the way a man who'd survived this long had to, and the fact that he'd let himself arrive at trust anyway, after 2 weeks of watching, felt like more of a gift than easy faith ever could have. I forgive you for that, she said. Considering what? Considering you were right to be careful, just wrong about me. Something in his face cracked open at that, not quite a smile, something rawer and more grateful than a smile. And for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the candle burning low between them. The night gone quiet enough that Mira could hear her own pulse, fast and unmistakable, in her ears. The almost moment came 3 nights later, and it came, as these things so often did in this castle, disguised as something else entirely. It was a council night, the kind of evening that left Cale's shoulders carrying a tightness Mira had learned to read from across a room, his pack's elders pressing him on matters of border security, on Sarah's family's growing influence, on whether the king intended to marry at all, or meant to leave the succession uncertain forever. Mira had not been present for the council itself, had only seen its aftermath in the set of his jaw when he finally retreated to his own chambers afterward, waving off the guard at his door with a tired gesture that meant he wanted to be alone. She brought him chamomile tea anyway, because it had become a habit neither of them had named, and found him standing at the window with his shirt collar open and his hair loose, staring out at the dark courtyard below with an expression she'd learned to recognize as the particular weariness of a man who carried a crown he'd never asked to want. "They want me to marry Sarah," he said, without turning around. "Or someone like her. Someone with the right bloodline, the right alliances. The elders have been patient about it for years. Tonight they stopped being patient." Mira set the tea down carefully, her hands not quite steady. "What did you tell them?" "That I'd consider it." His voice was flat, exhausted. "Which is what I always tell them, because the truth would start a war I'm not ready to fight." "What's the truth?" He turned finally, and the candlelight caught his face in a way that stripped every careful guard from it at once, and Mira understood, with her breath catching hard in her chest, that she had asked a question he hadn't meant to answer honestly, and was about to anyway. "The truth," he said, "is that I haven't wanted anyone the way the elders mean for years, maybe ever. And the one person I have wanted, in longer than I can remember, is standing in front of me right now holding a cup of tea I didn't ask for and didn't need, except that I needed exactly that, because you're the only person in this castle who brings me something without wanting anything from me in return." The room had gone very still. Mira's heartbeat was a drum in her own ears, loud enough she was certain he could hear it too. "Kyle," she said, his name unfamiliar and dangerous in her mouth, the first time she'd used it without his title attached. He took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the dark wood smoke scent that had become, somewhere in the last 150 days, the single most comforting thing in her entire world. His hand came up, slow, hesitant in a way nothing about him ever was, and brushed a loose strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that undid her more thoroughly than any declaration could have. "Mira," he said, low, rough, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. "I shouldn't." A fist hammered against the door, 3 sharp knocks, and both of them flinched back from each other like burned things. "Your Grace." A guard's voice, urgent through the wood. "You're needed. Now." Kyle's hand dropped. The careful, guarded king slid back over his face like a mask settling into place, and Mira watched it happen and felt the loss of it like a physical ache. "Later," he said to her, quiet, almost a promise. There was no later that night. There rarely was, in a castle where danger never gave anyone the courtesy of waiting. The summons turned out to be a border report. Nothing fatal, only urgent. A skirmish flaring up again at the same contested line that had cost Kale the silver wound weeks before. And Mira spent the rest of that night alone in her small chamber off the kitchens, lying awake and replaying the warmth of his hand against her cheek, until exhaustion finally won out over wanting. She woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices in the corridor outside, and her stomach dropped before she'd even fully opened her eyes, because raised voices in this castle, at this hour, were never good news. It was Greta's voice she heard first, sharp and frightened in a way Mira had never once heard from the unshakable head cook in all her months here. "Won't let you touch the larder until the king's own physician has looked at it himself. Do you understand me?" Mira dressed fast and ran for the kitchen, her bare feet cold against the stone floor, her heart already hammering with the particular dread that had become, over 150 days, her body's default response to any disruption in this place's careful rituals. The kitchen was chaos. 2 guards stood at the larder door, barring entry. Greta stood with her arms crossed, and flour still on her hands from bread she'd clearly abandoned mid-task, her face white in a way Mira had never seen on her. "What happened?" Mira said. "One of the scullery boys," Greta said, voice tight. "He was in the larder before dawn, fetching flour for the morning bake. Found something wrong with the grain stores. Whole sack of it smells off. Sharp. Bitter. Like almonds again, but worse this time. Stronger." Mira's whole body went cold. "How much grain?" "Enough for a week's bread, if no one had caught it." Greta's jaw was tight, her eyes hard. "Enough to poison every soul in this castle who eats from the king's kitchen, taster included. This wasn't aimed at one man anymore, Mira. This was aimed at all of us." It took the better part of the morning to confirm what the kitchen staff already feared in their bones, that the grain had been poisoned with something the herbalist eventually identified. After careful testing on a sample fed to a half-starved rat the kitchen kept for exactly this gruesome purpose, as a concentrated extract of the same patient nightshade variant that had killed Yvette, mixed in quantities strong enough to be lethal within hours of ingestion, rather than days. Whoever had done this had moved beyond testing the waters with single dishes. This was an attempt to poison the entire household at once, and the sheer scale of it left even Aldrich, usually so contained, visibly shaken. "This changes things," he said, standing in the ruined larder with his ledger forgotten at his side, his 3-finger tap gone erratic against his own thigh instead of any steady surface. "Whoever's doing this has stopped caring about subtlety. They're growing desperate or growing bold. Neither is good news." Kale arrived within the hour, summoned from his own chambers still half-dressed, his hair unbound and his eyes sharp with a fury Mira had never seen directed at anything but the empty air of his own frustration. He stood in the doorway of the larder and breathed in once, deep, and his whole face went hard as stone. "Wolfsbane root, ground into nightshade," he said. "Someone with knowledge of poisons beyond the common kind did this. This isn't a kitchen hand acting alone. This is someone who's studied how to kill a wolf, not just a man." Mira's stomach turned over. Who would know that kind of poison craft? Kale's eyes found hers, and something in them had gone very still and very careful. "Very few people," he said, "and every one of them has access to this castle that I've never once thought to question." The interrogations that followed were quiet, careful, and entirely unsatisfying. Every staff member with access to the larder was questioned: Greta, the scullery boys, the night guard who patrolled the kitchen corridor, even Mira herself, a fact that stung more than she expected it to, though she understood the necessity of it well enough not to argue. No one had seen anything. No one had smelled anything wrong before the scullery boys' discovery, which was, Aldrich pointed out grimly, itself suspicious, because a wolf's nose should have caught poison in the grain stores long before a human boy's nose ever did, unless whoever planted it had masked the scent somehow, using something strong enough to cover even a wolf's senses. "Rose oil," Mira said suddenly, the thought arriving whole and cold in her chest. Heavy rose scent could mask almost anything underneath it, couldn't it? If it was strong enough. Every head in the room turned toward her at once. "Lady Sarah's flowers," Aldrich said slowly. "She sent roses to this castle 3 times in the last month, each time fresh, heavily scented, placed near the kitchens for the king's table." "That's not proof of anything," Cale said, though his voice had gone tight, careful, the voice of a man who badly wanted to believe something and was forcing himself not to leap toward it too fast. "Roses are a common gift. It proves nothing on its own." "No," Mira agreed, "but it's a thread, and right now it's the only thread we have." She should have felt triumphant, pulling that thread loose. Instead, in the days that followed, she felt only a slow, sick unease building in her chest. Because the closer the investigation circled toward Sarah, the more Mira found herself doubting her own instincts, wondering if she'd simply let dislike masquerade as suspicion, if the satisfaction of finally having a name to hate had made her careless about actual evidence. Sarah, when finally questioned by Aldrich with careful diplomatic phrasing, denied everything with an outrage that read, to Mira's eye at least, as entirely genuine. Her glasshouse roses, she pointed out coldly, were a gift of beauty and nothing more, and she resented, deeply resented, the implication that her family's generations-old alliance with the Ashvale crown had curdled into attempted murder over a marriage proposal that hadn't even been formally offered yet. "You're grasping," she told Mira directly, cornering her in a quiet corridor 2 days later, her voice low and venomous in a way the public face she wore for Cale never showed. A taster with delusions of importance, looking for a villain dramatic enough to justify her own survival in this job. I almost pity you. "Then explain the roses," Mira said, steady despite the way her pulse had spiked at the confrontation. "I don't owe you an explanation for anything." Sarah's eyes had gone hard, dark, all pretense of courtly manners stripped away now that no one important was watching. "But I'll tell you this for free, taster, because I find I actually do pity you a little. Whoever wants Cale dead isn't someone foolish enough to leave a trail as obvious as flowers. If you're looking at me, you're looking in entirely the wrong direction. And every day you waste on me is a day the real threat gets closer to finishing what they started." It should have read as deflection. Instead, something in Mira's gut, the same instinct that had read wrongness in a honey jar before her tongue ever confirmed it, told her, with cold certainty, that Sarah was telling the truth. That night, lying awake in her narrow bed off the kitchens, Mira finally let herself follow the thought all the way through to its uncomfortable end. If it wasn't Sarah, then the circle of suspects narrowed down to people far closer to Cale than a noblewoman with political ambitions ever could be. People with access. People he trusted enough not to question. She thought of Aldrich's haunted face in the records room, his certainty that Yvette had named someone close before she died. She thought of his 3-finger tap against the ledger, steady and unbroken through every crisis this castle had thrown at him in months. Except, she realized now, turning the memory over carefully, it hadn't been quite steady the morning of the poisoned grain. It had been erratic, off rhythm, a small thing, easy to dismiss as shock. She thought, too, of how very thoroughly Aldrich had access to everything: the larder, the wine cellar, the king's private chambers, every ledger and every schedule and every staff rotation in the entire castle, a level of access that made even the guards look limited by comparison. And she thought, with a slow, cold dread settling into her bones, of how it had been Aldrich, and Aldrich alone, who first planted the suspicion of Sarah in her mind, offering up the steward's own theory with such careful, deliberate timing that she'd never once stopped to question whether he might be pointing her exactly where he wanted her looking, away from himself. She didn't sleep again that night. She brought her suspicion to Cale the next morning, carefully, quietly, in the privacy of his study before the day's business could swallow them both whole, and watched his face do something complicated and pained when she laid it out for him: the tap of Aldrich's fingers, the careful deflection toward Sarah, the unbroken decades of access no one had ever thought to question precisely because Aldrich himself had served 3 generations without a single mark against him. "He's served my family since before I was born," Cale said, voice low, almost pleading with her to be wrong. "He held me as a child. He stood beside my father's deathbed. If you're asking me to believe—" "I'm not asking you to believe anything," Mira said gently. "I'm asking you to be careful, the same way you were careful with me. 2 weeks of watching before you let yourself trust. Give him the same caution you gave a kitchen girl with no name worth knowing." Something in Cale's face cracked at that. Guilt, maybe, or grief arriving early for a loss that hadn't been confirmed yet. "If it's him," he said, "I don't know what I have left to trust in this castle at all." "You have me," Mira said, before she could stop herself, the words arriving fast and unguarded and entirely true. "Whatever else happens, you have me." He looked at her for a long moment, something raw and grateful moving behind his eyes, and reached for her hand across the desk between them. Not a kiss? Not yet. Just his fingers closing around hers, warm and steady. A wordless answer to a fear neither of them had said aloud. "I know," he said. "That's the only thing keeping me upright right now," proving it took another week, and the week stretched long and tense, every meal tasted with extra care, every corridor walked with a wariness that hadn't existed before suspicion had a face attached to it. Mira watched Aldrich closely now, not openly, never openly, but with the same patient attention she gave a jar of honey that smelled almost right. And slowly, carefully, the threads began to gather. A ledger entry from 3 years back, in Aldrich's own careful hand, recording a shipment of rare imported herbs that included, buried in a list of mundane spices, a quantity of dried nightshade root far beyond what any kitchen would ever legitimately need. A conversation overheard by a scullery girl, half remembered and nearly dismissed, of the steward speaking quietly with a traveling merchant about patience and timing, in a tone that hadn't matched the casual words at all. And finally, the detail that broke the case open entirely: a small vial, found tucked behind a loose stone in the records room wall, the same room Aldrich had once barred Mira from entering, containing a residue that matched exactly the poison found in both the honey and the grain. Aldrich's motive, when it finally surfaced under Cale's direct and furious questioning, turned out to be older and sadder than anyone expected. His own son, decades ago, had been passed over for a position of honor within the pack guard in favor of Cale's father's preferred candidate. A slight Aldrich had buried under decades of loyal service, until grief and resentment, fermenting quietly for years, had finally curdled into something far darker than either. He hadn't wanted the throne for himself. He'd wanted, in some twisted, grief-warped logic, to watch the bloodline that had wronged his family finally pay for it, one careful poisoning at a time, while he stood close enough to witness it, and far enough away to never be suspected. "I held you as a child," he told Cale, in the small stone room where he was finally confined, his voice flat and exhausted and stripped of every careful mask he'd worn for decades. "I rocked you to sleep more nights than your own father ever did, and I would have watched you die slowly, the same way my son's chances died slowly, year after year, while everyone called it loyalty." Cale said nothing in response. There was nothing, Mira understood, watching from the doorway, that could be said to a grief that old and that rotted. The relief that followed should have felt complete. Instead, it arrived strange and hollow, the particular exhaustion of a danger finally named after months of dread, leaving behind not triumph, but a tired, aching grief for everything the truth had cost. Yvette's death, the years of suspicion that had poisoned trust throughout the castle, a faithful old steward's decades of service curdled into something this dark. Mira found Cale alone that evening, standing in the same study where he'd once confessed his exhaustion to her over chamomile tea, his shoulders bowed under a weight that had nothing to do with the crown and everything to do with the particular grief of betrayal by someone who'd helped raise you. "He held me when my father died," Cale said quietly, not turning when she entered. "I remember his hands on my shoulders at the funeral. I remember thinking, even then, that he was the one person in this whole castle who'd never once made me feel like a king instead of a boy who'd lost his father too young. Grief doesn't erase what he did," Mira said softly, "but it explains it. Those aren't the same thing." "No." He turned finally, and his eyes were red-rimmed in a way she'd never seen on him, the careful alpha mask gone entirely, leaving only a tired, grieving man underneath. "I keep thinking about all the people I've suspected this season. You, my own counsel, half my guard, and the one person it actually was the one person I never once thought to question, because questioning him felt like questioning my own childhood." Mira crossed the room and took his hand without asking permission, the way he'd taken hers once across his desk, and felt his fingers close around hers immediately, gratefully, like a man finally allowed to stop holding himself together alone. "You're allowed to grieve him," she said, "even now, even knowing what he did." "Is that what this is?" His voice had gone rough, almost raw. "Grief? I think it's several things at once," Mira said. "I think that's allowed too." The days following Aldrich's exposure carried a strange new quiet through the castle. Not peace exactly, but the particular hush of a wound finally lanced, the poison drained even if the scar would take longer to heal than anyone wanted to admit. Mira found herself, for the first time in months, tasting food without the constant hum of dread underneath every bite, and the relief of that small mercy felt almost disorienting after so long without it. Cale changed too, in ways small enough that only someone watching as closely as Mira had been would notice them. He laughed more easily. Still rare, still surprised by his own laughter, but no longer entirely absent. He sought her out in moments that had nothing to do with poison or council business, finding excuses to walk past the kitchens at hours he'd never bothered with before, lingering in doorways with a warmth in his eyes that he no longer bothered hiding from the staff who noticed. The staff noticed everything, of course. Greta started leaving slightly larger portions on Mira's tasting tray, claiming it was simply efficient use of ingredients. though the extra care in her voice when she said it told a different story. Even the guards had softened toward her, nodding at her now in the corridors with something that looked almost like respect, rather than the wary tolerance they'd shown her in her early months. It was Greta, in fact, who finally said aloud what everyone else had only implied. "You know, he watches you the way my late husband used to watch a particularly good harvest," she said one morning, kneading dough with brisk, efficient hands, not bothering to look up. Like something he can't quite believe he's lucky enough to have. Mira's face went hot. "It's not like that." "It's exactly like that, and you'd know it if you weren't so determined to talk yourself out of believing anything good could happen to you." Greta's eyes flicked up then, sharp and not unkind. "That's your trouble, girl. Not lack of courage. You've got courage enough to pull silver from a king's ribs with your bare hands. Your trouble is you've never once let yourself believe you deserve the good thing once it's standing right in front of you." Mira didn't have an answer for that. She turned back to her tasting tray and said nothing, because Greta, infuriatingly, was right. The jealousy arrived 3 weeks later, uninvited and entirely unwelcome, in the shape of a visiting lord's son named Tobias. Handsome, easy smiling. The kind of charm that came naturally to men who'd never had to fight for anything in their lives. Who took one look at Mira across the great hall during a minor feast for visiting allies, and decided, with the careless confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted, that she was worth the effort of pursuit. He found her near the wine table, where she stood quietly fulfilling her duty before the cups were carried to the high table, and leaned against the wall beside her with an easy grace that suggested he'd practiced the pose in front of a mirror more than once. "You're the king's taster," he said. "I've heard about you. The one who's lasted nearly half a year." "Among other things," Mira said, not looking up from the wine she was checking. "I find that admirable. Most women in your position would have run for safer work by now." His smile widened, and he leaned a fraction closer, his voice dropping into something he clearly thought of as charming. "Tell me, does the danger ever frighten you, or have you simply grown used to it?" "Both," Mira said, "depending on the day. I'd like to hear more about that if you'd let me." He reached out, casual as anything, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with 2 fingers. The gesture far too familiar for 2 strangers who'd exchanged perhaps a dozen words. Mira froze, more startled than offended, and opened her mouth to step back. And that was the exact moment Cale's voice cut across the hall, low and absolutely final, carrying a weight that silenced 3 nearby conversations at once. "Tobias." The young lord's hand dropped immediately, and he turned, smile faltering for the first time, to find Cale standing perhaps 10 feet away with an expression that had gone utterly, dangerously still. The king's eyes weren't on Tobias at all. They were fixed on the spot where his fingers had touched Mira's hair, dark and possessive in a way she'd never seen from him in public, his jaw working once, hard, before he spoke again. "Find somewhere else to stand," Kyle said. Quiet. Final. The kind of quiet that carried more weight than shouting ever could. Tobias, to his credit, read the room fast enough to retreat without further comment, murmuring something about finding his father. And the moment he was gone, Cale's eyes finally found Mira's properly, and what was in them stole the breath clean out of her chest. "Are you all right?" he said. Not quite a question. More like he was checking, hands almost reaching for her before he caught himself, remembering the hall full of watching eyes. "I'm fine," Mira said. "He was harmless, just forward. He had no right to touch you." The words came out rougher than he probably intended, and something in his face, jaw tight, eyes dark, told her this wasn't entirely about propriety. No one touches you without your wanting it. No one. Possessive, Mira said, half teasing, testing the ground beneath the moment. Yes, Cale said, simply without apology, and the bluntness of that single word did more to her than any flowery declaration could have. He found her again later that night, after the feast had wound down and the hall had emptied into quiet, candlelit corridors. And this time there was no fist hammering at a door to pull them apart, no council summons, no crisis demanding his attention. Just the two of them, alone in the corridor outside the kitchens, the smell of dying candle wax and cooling stone thick around them. "I owe you an apology," he said, quiet, his voice rough in a way she'd come to recognize as the sound of him being honest past the point of comfort. "For tonight, for making a scene in front of half my visiting allies over a boy's harmless flirtation." "It wasn't harmless to you," Mira said. "Why not?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes finding hers in the candlelight, and holding there with an intensity that made her pulse climb. "Because watching another man touch you made something in me want to put my fists through a wall," he said finally. "Because I've spent months telling myself this is restraint, this is patience, this is a king being careful with someone who matters more than I know how to say. And then I watched some lordling's son tuck your hair behind your ear like he had any right to, and every careful thing I've told myself fell apart in about 2 seconds." "That's not restraint you're describing," Mira said softly. "That sounds like jealousy." "It was jealousy," he said, no apology in it now. "Ugly, possessive jealousy, the kind I've spent my whole life being taught a king isn't supposed to feel, because kings are supposed to be above wanting anything that badly." His hand came up, slow, and brushed her cheek the way it had once before, interrupted then by duty, uninterrupted now. "I'm not above it, not when it comes to you. I don't think I ever was." The corridor had gone very quiet. Mira's heart was a drum in her own ears, and she could smell him. That dark wood smoke warmth, closer now than it had ever been, mixed with something new underneath it that she didn't have a name for yet but felt, deep in her chest, that she would learn to recognize as want. "Cale," she said, his name soft and certain in her mouth. "Tell me to stop," he said, voice low, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "And I will. I need you to know that. Whatever happens between us, it happens because you choose it, not because I'm a king who's decided to want something." "I'm not telling you to stop," Mira said. He kissed her then, finally, after months of almost, slow and careful at first, like a man memorizing something he was afraid might be taken from him, and then deeper, surer, his hand sliding into her hair while hers fisted in the front of his shirt, the candle beside them guttering low and neither of them caring at all. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, both of them breathing unsteadily in the quiet corridor, Cale let out a low sound that was almost a laugh, almost disbelief. "I've wanted to do that," he said, "since the night you pulled silver out of my ribs and told me I should eat more carefully." "That's a strange thing to find romantic," Mira said, breathless, smiling despite herself. "You're a strange thing to find myself in love with," he said. "Apparently I don't mind." The word love sat between them, simple and enormous, and Mira felt it land somewhere deep and unguarded in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with candlelight, and everything to do with a man who just said the truest thing he knew how to say. The morning after should have felt like the beginning of something easier. Instead, it brought the night the poison finally became real in a way no near miss before it had managed. It started, as everything in this castle seemed to start, with something small and easily missed. A headache, behind Mira's own eyes, faint and dull. The kind she might have dismissed as simple exhaustion after a long week if she hadn't trained herself, over months of this job, to question every single sensation in her own body the moment it deviated from ordinary. She was tasting the evening stew, a rich, dark thing of beef and root vegetables that Greta had spent all afternoon coaxing into something hearty enough for the cooling autumn nights, and the bite she took tasted, for 1/2 second, entirely ordinary. Then the bitterness arrived, sharp, metallic, blooming up from the back of her tongue with a wrongness that made her whole body go cold before her mind had even finished processing what she'd tasted. "Greta," she said, and her own voice sounded strange and distant in her ears. "Something's wrong." Greta's head snapped up from across the kitchen, and whatever she saw in Mira's face had her moving instantly, hands already reaching to steady her. Mira, look at me. What does it taste like?" "Metal," Mira said, the word coming slower now, her tongue feeling thick and clumsy in her mouth. "Bitter, like the honey but stronger, much stronger." Her vision had started to swim at the edges, soft gray creeping in like fog rolling over a field, and somewhere distant she heard her own knees buckle, heard Greta's voice rising into something close to a scream for help. Heard, faintest of all, the sound of her own heartbeat slowing in a way that some animal part of her brain recognized, with cold and absolute clarity, as the sound of dying. She came back to awareness in pieces, the way drowning people are said to surface. First sound, distorted and far away, then the dull ache of her own body, then finally, light, harsh and unwelcome against eyes that didn't want to open yet. "Can't lose her. Do you understand me? I will not lose her." That was Cale's voice, raw and ragged in a way she'd never heard from him, not even in the worst of the council pressures, not even with silver in his ribs. "Your Grace, she's stabilizing. The herbalist's antidote is working. You need to step back and let us—" "I'm not stepping back." Flat. Final. The voice of a king who had stopped entirely caring whether anyone in the room thought it appropriate for him to be holding a poison taster's hand like his own life depended on it. Mira's eyes finally opened, slow and heavy, and the first thing she saw, swimming into focus through the lingering fog of whatever poison had nearly taken her, was Cale's face above her own, pale, exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed in a way that told her he'd been awake at her bedside far longer than was good for him. Mira. Her name in his mouth came out broken, relief and terror tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate them. "You're awake. You're—" His voice cracked entirely, and he pressed his forehead to the back of her hand, his whole body shaking with something he wasn't bothering to hide from anyone in the room. "How long?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper, her throat raw and aching. 2 days. It was Greta's voice now, from somewhere near the foot of the bed, thick with relief. 2 days you've been unconscious. The herbalist worked herself half to death finding the right antidote in time. You very nearly didn't make it, girl." "What happened?" Mira said. "The stew. Who? We don't know yet. Aldrich's replacement, a younger steward, hastily promoted in the wake of the previous betrayal, his name still unfamiliar in Mira's poison-fogged mind, spoke from near the door, his voice carrying the careful weight of someone delivering bad news. "The kitchen's been sealed. Every staff member questioned. We have no clear answer yet on who tampered with the stew, or when." Cale's head came up at that, and the look that crossed his face was something Mira had never seen on him before. Not the careful alpha mask, not even the raw grief she'd witnessed after Aldrich's exposure. Something colder, more dangerous. The look of a man who had just discovered in the most terrifying way possible exactly how much he stood to lose and had run out of patience for not knowing who threatened it. "Then we find out," he said, voice flat as stone. "If I have to question every soul in this castle myself." She slept again after that, exhausted past the point of fighting it, and woke hours later to find Cale still there, slumped in a chair beside her bed with his head bowed, and his hand still loosely curled around hers. Asleep at last, though clearly against his own will, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion he'd been holding off for 2 straight days. She watched him sleep for a long moment, the way she had once before in his own chamber after the silver wound, and felt the same aching tenderness rise up in her chest, sharper now, more frightening, because she understood with sudden clarity exactly how close she had come to never seeing his face again. His eyes opened slowly, as if he'd felt her watching even through sleep, and the relief that crossed his face on finding her awake and looking back at him was raw enough to ache. "You should be resting," he said, voice still thick with sleep. "So should you," Mira said, echoing words she'd said to him once before in a different room, under different circumstances. "You look terrible." A faint, exhausted laugh escaped him, surprised out of his own chest. "I nearly lost you. Forgive me for letting it show." "You didn't lose me," Mira said softly. "I'm right here." "You almost weren't." His hand tightened around hers, and his voice, when it came again, had dropped into something rawer, more frightened than she'd ever heard from him. "I keep thinking about all the months I told myself I was being careful, patient, restrained, as if restraint mattered at all, if I lost you before I ever said the things I should have said." "Say them now," Mira said. He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing slow circles over her knuckles, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone soft and unguarded in a way she'd rarely heard from him even in their most private moments. "I love you," he said. Not the careful, deniable kind of love a king is allowed to feel for someone the council hasn't approved. The real kind. The kind that nearly broke me in half when Greta told me you'd collapsed in the kitchen. I should have said it the night I kissed you, before any of this happened. I'm saying it now because I refuse to wait any longer and risk losing the chance entirely." Mira's eyes burned, exhaustion and relief and overwhelming feeling tangling together until she couldn't separate one from the other. "I love you too," she said, the words simple and entirely true. "I think I have for longer than I let myself admit." He kissed her then, slow and careful, mindful of how fragile she still was, and the kiss carried none of the urgency of their first one, only a quiet, steady tenderness that felt, to Mira, like a promise being made without either of them needing to say the words aloud. The investigation into the poisoned stew moved fast once Cale's patience finally ran out, and the truth, when it surfaced 3 days later, arrived in a shape that surprised exactly no one who'd been paying close attention, and devastated almost everyone else. It was a kitchen hand named Petra, young, quiet, easily overlooked in a kitchen full of louder, more visible staff, who finally cracked under careful questioning, her confession spilling out in a rush of tears and old grief. Once Cale's investigators presented her with evidence too clear to deny. A vial matching the poison's signature found hidden in her own small chamber. Purchased, the investigators eventually traced, from a merchant with known ties to the rival pack, whose scouting party had wounded Cale with silver weeks before. Her motive, unlike Aldrich's slow-burning decades of resentment, was simpler and rawer. Her brother, killed in that same border skirmish, a death she'd decided, in her grief, to lay entirely at Cale's feet, reasoning that a king who rode out to defend his own borders himself was a king who'd gotten her brother killed through reckless pride rather than necessary duty. "She wasn't trying to kill you specifically that night," the lead investigator told Kale and Mira both, once the confession was fully extracted. She admits she didn't even know your taster would be the one to test the stew first. She simply wanted you dead, and didn't think carefully enough about who might die reaching that food before you ever touched it. It was, Mira thought, listening to this explanation with her body still weak from the poison's lingering effects, a particularly bitter kind of irony, that she had nearly died not because anyone wanted her specifically gone, but because she had simply been doing her job, standing between a king and a danger that hadn't cared whose body it passed through first. Kale's face, hearing this, had gone something between fury and grief, the particular helplessness of a leader confronting how much pain his own decisions, however necessary, had rippled outward into lives he'd never meant to touch. She lost her brother because of a war I didn't start, he said quietly, later, alone with Mira in the privacy of his own chambers. And in her grief, she nearly took you from me instead. I don't know how to hold both of those truths at once without it breaking something in me. You don't have to hold them perfectly, Mira said, her voice still rough from days of recovery. You just have to keep trying. That's all any of us can do. He didn't answer that directly, but his arms came around her instead, careful of her healing body, and held her the way a man holds something he's terrified of losing twice. Recovery took the better part of 2 weeks, and Mira spent most of it in a small, sun-warmed room near Kale's own chambers, rather than her usual narrow bed off the kitchen's. A change Kale had insisted on without quite asking permission, and one she found, to her own surprise, that she didn't mind at all. Greta visited daily, bringing broths and bread, and a running commentary on kitchen gossip that Mira suspected was meant entirely as a kindness, a way of keeping her tethered to ordinary life, while her body slowly remembered how to be strong again. The new steward visited too, careful and formal, delivering updates on castle business that Mira understood, with quiet amusement, were really just an excuse to check on her welfare without admitting that's what he was doing. And Kale visited every evening, without fail, sitting beside her bed long after his council duties should have claimed him, talking about nothing important at all, old memories of his boyhood, stories about his hounds in the yard, the particular stubbornness of a horse he'd once owned that refused to be ridden by anyone but him, small, ordinary things that felt, after months of poison and suspicion and careful guarded distance, like the most precious gift either of them had to give. "You're different with me now," she told him one evening, 2 weeks into her recovery, watching him from her pillows while he sat in the chair he'd claimed as permanently his own beside her bed. "Lighter, even with everything that's happened. I spent 6 years as king convinced that wanting anything too openly was a weakness my enemies would exploit." He reached for her hand, the gesture so familiar now it felt like coming home. "Nearly losing you taught me that hiding what I want hasn't made me safer. It's only made me lonelier. I'm done being lonely, Mira. I'd rather be vulnerable and happy than guarded and hollow." "That sounds like a king's speech," Mira said, smiling despite the warmth rising in her chest. "It's not a speech," he said. "It's just true." The council, when Kale finally announced his intentions to them formally, did not receive the news with universal grace. He called the gathering himself, in the great hall, every elder and noble of standing present, Sarah among them with an expression carefully arranged into polite neutrality that didn't quite mask the calculation underneath it. Mira stood at the edge of the hall, dressed simply, her body still carrying the faint, lingering weakness of her recovery, watching Kyle stand before his own council with a steadiness that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "I've called you here," he said, voice carrying easily across the hall, "to address a question several of you have raised with increasing impatience over the past year. The matter of succession, the matter of who I intend to make my queen. A murmur swept the hall, eyes turning, calculating, several already drifting toward Sira with expectant assumption. I've spent 6 years as your king, Kale continued, trying to be exactly what this council wanted of me. Cautious, strategic, married for alliance rather than for the simple, unfashionable reason of actually wanting someone. His eyes found Mira's across the hall and held there, steady and certain. I'm done with that approach. It's made me a careful king. It's never once made me a happy man. The murmur grew louder. One of the elder lords rose half out of his seat, already objecting, and Kale's voice cut across the rising noise without effort. The absolute authority of an alpha king who had finally stopped asking permission to want what he wanted. The woman who has saved my life 4 times this season, he said, who pulled silver from my own ribs with her bare hands when no one else in this castle had the steadiness to do it, who has tasted every poison meant for me and survived nearly the last one that nearly succeeded. That woman is the one I intend to bond, not for alliance, not for bloodline, because she is, without question or qualification, the only person in this entire castle I have ever fully trusted with my life. He crossed the hall toward her as he spoke, every eye in the room following him, and Mira's heart climbed into her throat as he stopped before her, taking both her hands in his eyes searching hers with a question underneath the words he'd just declared to an entire hall of witnesses. Mira, he said, quieter now. Just for her despite the crowd around them. I'm asking you publicly because I should have stopped hiding this a long time ago. Will you bond with me? Not because a king asked, because I'm asking, as a man who loves you, and wants the whole world to know it. The hall had gone utterly silent, every breath held, every eye fixed on the two of them standing at its center. Mira felt the weight of all that watching, felt Sarah's gaze burning somewhere to her left, felt the elder lord's outrage still simmering near his seat, felt every single moment of the past 170-some days she'd spent in this castle expecting, on some level, to die nameless and unremarked, and felt, underneath all of it, a warmth rising up from her chest that had nothing to do with fear at all. Yes, she said, her voice clear enough to carry across the silent hall. I'll bond with you, not because you're a king, because you're the one person who ever made me believe I was worth more than the job that was supposed to kill me. The bond, when it sealed, didn't arrive as a roar of magic or a blinding flash of light the way old stories sometimes claimed. It arrived instead as warmth, a sudden total flooding of warmth that spread out from where Kale's hands held hers, climbing up through her wrists and into her chest until it felt like sunlight had somehow gotten trapped beneath her skin. And beneath that warmth, faint and unmistakable, the sudden new awareness of him, his heartbeat, steady and strong, settling into rhythm with her own, as if they'd always been meant to keep the same time. His scent changed too in that moment, or maybe her ability to read it simply sharpened. The dark wood smoke warmth she'd grown to love over months suddenly layered with something new, something that smelled, impossibly, like home, like the particular safety of a place she'd never quite believed she was allowed to belong. Kale's breath caught audibly, his eyes going wide and bright, and Mira understood, watching the wonder move across his face, that he was feeling the exact same thing from his side of the new bond, her own scent blooming clear and warm, and entirely his in a way that hadn't existed a moment before. There it is, he said, voice rough with feeling, a smile breaking across his face that she'd never seen from him in public before, unguarded and entirely real. I can feel you, all of you. Every careful wall I thought I needed to keep up around my own heart. Gone. Just like that. The hall around them had erupted into noise, some of it shocked, some of it to Mira's quiet surprise, genuinely celebratory. The younger guards and kitchen staff who'd watched her survive this castle for months, now cheering loud enough to drown out the elder lord's protests entirely. Greta's voice rose clear above the rest, fierce and proud, and somewhere near the back of the hall, Mira caught sight of the new young steward grinning like he'd won something himself. Sierra's face, when Mira finally let herself look, had settled into something that wasn't quite warmth but wasn't quite the cold calculation of before either. Something more like grudging respect, the acknowledgement of a battle lost cleanly, without bitterness left to spend on it. Cale's hand came up to cradle her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek with a tenderness that the hall full of watching eyes couldn't touch, couldn't diminish, couldn't make smaller than it actually was. "They all dismissed you," he said quietly, just for her, though half the hall was surely close enough to hear. "Furniture that occasionally died. That's what this castle thought it was hiring when they brought you in. They never once thought to wonder what you'd become." "And what's that?" Mira asked, breathless, her whole body still humming with the bond's new warmth. "Everything," he said simply. "You became everything." He kissed her then, in front of the entire hall, slow and certain and utterly unhurried, and Mira felt the warmth of the bond pulse brighter with the contact, felt his heartbeat settle further into rhythm with her own, felt, underneath all of it, the steady, simple certainty that she had never once been hired merely to taste his food. She had been hired to survive a job that killed nearly everyone who held it. She had become, instead, the one thing in this entire castle that no poison, no betrayal, and no careful, guarded distance had ever managed to take from him. And standing there in the warm circle of his arms, with the whole hall watching, and the bond singing warm and certain beneath her skin, she understood, finally and completely, exactly what she had become. His. Chosen. Not in spite of the danger, but somehow, impossibly, because of everything they'd survived together to reach this exact moment. The hall's noise rose and fell around them, distant now, unimportant, and Cale pressed his forehead to hers the way he had once before in a quiet, candlelit corridor, his breath unsteady, his hands still cradling her face like something he intended never to let go of again. "Stay," he murmured, the same word he'd said to her once before, in a different room, under far more frightened circumstances. "Just stay, with me, for all of it, the good days and the dangerous ones both." "I already did," Mira said softly, her hand coming up to rest over his heart, feeling it beat steady and sure beneath her palm. "I think I started staying the night I pulled silver out of your ribs and you asked me to. I never really left after that." He laughed then, low and real, the sound she'd come to treasure more than any declaration, and pulled her closer against him, and the bond between them settled into something steady and permanent, and entirely theirs. Not a fairy tale ending so much as a beginning, breathless and uncertain and absolutely finally chosen.